Think about how small 15 is. 15 steps across a room, 15 seconds of a song, 15 cells from a human body, cells so small you could fit 6,000 of them across the width of a single human hair. In June of 1989, a 14-year-old girl was murdered on her way to school in Las Vegas, Nevada. She left her front door that morning and never came back. Her killer left behind almost nothing, just a trace of biological material on her clothing, so small that for 32 years, no laboratory in the world could do anything useful with it. They tried. They tested it again and again as the decades passed and the technology improved. 30 different samples from 30 different people were compared against it over the years. Not one matched. The sample was too small, too degraded, too far gone to read. Every detective who worked the case was told the same thing. There simply wasn't enough to work with. And then in 2021, a man in Las Vegas donated $5,000, and a laboratory in Texas took those 15 cells, 0.12 nanograms of DNA, the equivalent of nothing, and did what every other lab had said was impossible. They built a complete genetic profile. They ran it through a genealogy database. They built a family tree, and 7 months after they started, they had a name. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. This is exactly what we do here. The name they found belonged to a man who had been dead for 26 years. He had killed before, been arrested, and walked free. And he had gone to his grave, as far as anyone knew, without ever being connected to a 14-year-old girl on her way to school. This is the story of Stephanie Isaacson, the case that broke science's lower limit, and the answer that came 32 years too late for justice, but not too late for the truth. To understand what was taken, you have to start with who Stephanie Isaacson actually was. She was 14 years old, and by every account from the people who loved her, she was the kind of daughter who made ordinary life feel full. She and her father, John Isaacson, had the kind of bond you don't see every day. They rode horses together and motorcycles. They went camping, hunting, and boating. They got their scuba diving certifications at Lake Mead, a 14-year-old and her dad, certified divers, checking it off a list together. When her parents divorced, Stephanie chose to live with her father, even though it meant spending less time with her younger sister Joanne, who was 5 years old at the time and lived with their mother Sharon. The two sisters made the most of what time they had. Wednesdays, weekends, and holidays. That was their rhythm. Half a week apart, then together again. Las Vegas in 1989 was not the polished resort city it would become. It was still a sprawling, sun-baked desert town, growing fast, its edges rough and unfinished, stretches of undeveloped land sitting between neighborhoods like gaps in a sentence. One of those gaps was a sandlot near Nellis Boulevard, about a half-mile from where Stephanie and her father lived. It was a familiar shortcut, the kind of route a teenager takes every day without thinking twice. It was the route she took on the morning of June 1st, 1989, on her way to El Dorado High School. That was the last morning of her life, and the sandlot she cut through on her way to class was where the police would find her that same evening. She was 14 years old. She had a father who adored her, a little sister who looked up to her, and a whole life in front of her. That is who Stephanie Isaacson was, and that is who this case is about, even when it becomes a story about cells and nanograms and the limits of science. It is always, underneath all of that, about her. On the morning of June 1st, 1989, Stephanie left home and began walking her usual route to El Dorado High School. She cut through the open sandlot near Nellis Boulevard the way she always did. She never arrived at school. By afternoon, her father was worried. He called the school. He was told his daughter had never come in that morning. He called her friends. None of them had seen her. And so John Isaacson did what a father does. He went looking himself, driving the streets and the lots around the neighborhood, searching for his 14-year-old daughter. It was a friend of John's, Gary Braley, who spotted it first. Stephanie's school books, lying in the open sandlot she would have cut through on her way to class. By the time police arrived, they found Stephanie in that same lot, less than a half-mile from the home she had left that morning. She had been attacked, sexually assaulted, and strangled. She had been bludgeoned. The violence was severe, and it was deliberate. This was not a chaotic crime. This was someone who had waited, or watched, and had done what he came to do. Las Vegas was shocked in the way small communities are shocked when something this terrible reaches this close. 14 years old, on her way to school, a route she had walked 100 times before. The Metropolitan Police Department launched a full investigation. They searched the area. They interviewed neighbors and students and everyone who might have known her or seen something. And at the scene, they did something that would matter enormously 32 years later. They recovered biological evidence, a semen sample, left on Stephanie's shirt. In 1989, that sample could tell investigators certain things. But the full power of what it contained, the complete genetic signature of the man who left it, was decades beyond the technology of that morning. They had his DNA, they just couldn't read it yet. In the years after Stephanie's murder, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department did not walk away from her case. They came back to it, again and again, every time the technology improved enough to try something new. The DNA sample on her shirt was tested and retested across the decades. Every advancement in forensic science brought them back to the same small piece of evidence, hoping that this time they could get more out of it. And slowly, the technology did improve. In 2007, 18 years after the murder, the lab finally managed to extract a usable DNA profile from the sample. After nearly 2 decades, they finally had the killer's genetic fingerprint in a form they could use. They immediately began comparing it against suspects. Over the next 13 years, from 2007 to 2020, investigators collected DNA from more than 30 people who had been connected to the case at various points. Persons of interest, men with relevant histories, anyone the investigation had ever looked at. 30 samples, 30 comparisons. None of them matched. The killer's DNA was sitting in a file in Las Vegas. His profile was known. His genetic code had been sitting there since 1989, patiently waiting. But he wasn't in any database, hadn't been caught for anything that would put his DNA in the system, and none of the people police had ever looked at were him. The evidence knew who he was. The investigators just had no way to get from that profile to a name. By 2020, the case had been cold for 31 years. The detectives working it, including cold case detective Terry Miller, who had spent 3 years building a relationship with Stephanie's family, calling them every 6 months with updates, were running out of options. As Detective Dan Long would later say, they were at the wall. The next step they tried would be the last shot they had. The break in Stephanie Isaacson's case did not come from a government agency, a new law, or a breakthrough announced by a major laboratory. It came from one person writing a check. In November of 2020, a Las Vegas entrepreneur and philanthropist named Justin Wu made a $5,000 donation to Othram, a private forensic laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, that specialized in exactly one thing: extracting usable genetic profiles from the tiniest, most degraded, most seemingly hopeless DNA samples in existence. Wu had met Othram's founder and CEO David Middleman through a mutual friend, and he was moved enough by the company's mission to fund a single cold case from his own pocket. He asked only that the money go toward a Las Vegas case. The Metropolitan Police Department's forensics director, Kim Murga, selected Stephanie Isaacson's case. The evidence was sent to Texas in January of 2021. What was in that evidence envelope was almost nothing. The sample they sent to Othram was 0.12 nanograms of DNA, the equivalent of roughly 15 human cells. To put that in context, a standard home ancestry DNA test collects somewhere between 750 and 1,000 nanograms. What Las Vegas sent to Othram was 6,000 times smaller than that. It was, at that point, the smallest sample of DNA ever submitted to a forensic lab in an attempt to solve a crime. Most labs would have sent it back. Most labs could not have done anything with it. Othram was built for exactly this situation, samples that every other method had already failed. Their entire purpose was the case that everyone else had called unsolvable. They got to work, and the clock started running. To understand what Othram did with 15 cells, you first have to understand why the standard approach had failed for 30 years. The traditional DNA tool for criminal cases is CODIS, the FBI's national database, which holds the DNA profiles of people who have been arrested or convicted of qualifying crimes. Run a crime scene sample against CODIS, and if your suspect is in there, you get a match. The problem is the same one we've seen in every case on this channel. CODIS only contains people who have already been caught. If your killer has never been entered into the system, CODIS is a wall with no door. That was the wall Stephanie's case had been hitting for 13 years, every time they ran a comparison. Othram's approach is completely different. Instead of looking for the killer, it looks for his family. Using a method called whole genome sequencing, the lab extracts every usable genetic marker from the evidence. Hundreds of thousands of data points, far more than standard forensic testing captures. From those data points, they build what's called a genealogical profile, a map of the killer's genetic makeup detailed enough to search ancestry databases, where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to trace their family history. The search looks for partial matches, a distant cousin here, a second cousin there. Those matches become the roots of a family tree. The genealogists grow that tree outward and inward, branch by branch, generation by generation, until the branches converge on a small number of living people who match all the available criteria: the right age, the right gender, the right geography, the right time period. From 15 cells, Othram began building that tree. The DNA told them the killer had a complex ancestry, a mix of French-Canadian descent from New England and more recent French-Canadian roots from Canada, which made the genealogical work a little harder than usual. The branches didn't line up in a simple, clean way, but they kept building. 7 months after they received the sample, they had narrowed the tree to 2 possible suspects, then 1, and they handed that name back to Las Vegas detectives to verify. The name Othram handed to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department was Darren Roy Marchand. When investigators looked into him, 2 things struck them immediately. The first was that Marchand was dead. He had died by suicide in 1995, at the age of 29, 6 years after Stephanie's murder, and 26 years before the DNA finally pointed to him. There would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom where Stephanie's family could sit and hear a verdict read aloud. The second thing was his history. 3 years before he killed Stephanie, Darren Marchand had been arrested in connection with the strangulation murder of a 24-year-old Las Vegas woman named Nanette Vanderberg, killed on February 27, 1986. He was 20 years old at the time. The case against him had been dismissed. Lack of evidence. The same reason that plagued every cold case of that era. DNA testing did not yet exist in a form that could have nailed him in 1986, and without it, the case fell apart. Marchand walked free. 3 years later, Stephanie Isaacson was walking to school. The connection between the 2 cases was confirmed not through genealogy, but through the old-fashioned method of direct comparison. Marchand's DNA had been collected and stored in connection with the 1986 Vanderberg case. Investigators compared that stored sample against the DNA from Stephanie's shirt. It matched completely. The same man. Both crimes. Confirmed. And then investigators looked at the geography. In 1989, when Stephanie Isaacson was murdered in that sandlot near Nellis Boulevard, Darren Marchand had been living in Las Vegas. The same city, the same streets, the same neighborhood orbit. He was 23 years old. He had already killed once and walked free. He had been right there, invisible, the entire time. On July 21, 2021, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department held a press conference. They announced that the world record for the smallest DNA sample ever used to solve a crime had just been set: 0.12 nanograms, 15 cells, and 32 years of waiting. The case of Stephanie Isaacson was solved. The killer's name was Darren Roy Marchand. 32 years is not an abstract number. It is specific and personal for the people who lived inside it. John Isaacson, Stephanie's father, the man who had scuba dived with her at Lake Mead, who had taught her to ride horses and motorcycles, who had driven the streets of Las Vegas that June evening, desperately looking for his daughter, waited 32 years for that press conference. He was not waiting in peace. He was waiting the way a parent waits when the question of who took their child from them has no answer. The cold cases that true crime tends to reduce to a puzzle are not puzzles to the people at the center of them. They are open wounds that don't heal, because healing requires a kind of closure that the absence of an answer makes impossible. John gave an interview to the Las Vegas Review-Journal after the case was solved, and in it, he said something that stopped every reporter who covered the story. "That son of a bitch got me twice," he said. "Once when he killed my daughter, and the other one when I didn't get the opportunity to look him in the eye." Marchand died in 1995. John Isaacson had spent 32 years waiting for a moment that would never come. Not because justice was denied by a court or a legal technicality, but because the man who killed his daughter had already escaped it on his own terms, years before the science could reach him. Stephanie's mother's statement, read aloud at the press conference, carried the same exhausted grief. She said she was glad they had finally found who murdered her daughter. She said she had never believed the case would be solved. And then she said the thing that summarized it all: it was good to have some closure, but there was no justice for Stephanie at all. "We will never have complete closure," she said, "because nothing will ever bring our daughter back to us." Stephanie Isaacson's case is the record holder, the smallest DNA sample ever used to solve a murder. At the time, it was solved in 2021, but the record itself isn't the point. The record is just the most visible symbol of something larger, a shift in what is possible. For most of the history of DNA forensics, labs worked within certain assumed limits. There was a floor below which a sample was considered too small, too degraded, too compromised to yield anything useful. Cases that fell below that floor were essentially written off. The evidence might still be stored, might still be preserved, but it was understood to be unreachable. It was in a category investigators called unsolvable. What Othram did, and what this case proved, is that the floor isn't fixed. It can be lowered. The limit isn't a law of nature. It's a limit of methodology, and methodology can improve. David Middleman, Othram's CEO, said it plainly after the Isaacson case was announced. When you can access information from such a small amount of DNA, it opens up the possibility for so many other cases that have been historically considered cold and unsolvable. Cases that every previous lab had tested and failed on. Cases that were sitting in evidence rooms across the country, labeled hopeless, waiting. The Las Vegas forensics director, Kim Murga, made the same point from the other side. The department had tested this evidence multiple times over the decades. They weren't negligent. They were doing everything the technology of their era allowed. The technology just wasn't good enough until 2021. And when it finally was, one of the first cases it reached was Stephanie's. The other detail that matters here, and that every cold case investigator in America noticed when this announcement came out, is the cost. $5,000. A single private donation from one Las Vegas resident who wanted to help his community. The barrier between an unsolvable cold case and a solved one was, in this instance, $5,000 and a lab willing to try. One of the quieter details of this case, and one that deserves to be said plainly, is that solving Stephanie Isaacson's murder also solved another. Nanette Vanderburg was 24 years old when she was strangled in Las Vegas on February 27, 1986, 3 years before Stephanie. Darren Marchand had been arrested in connection with her killing, and the case against him had been dismissed for lack of evidence. He walked free. When the DNA from Stephanie's case was confirmed as Marchand's, investigators compared it against the stored evidence from Nanette Vanderburg's murder. It matched. The same man, the same hands, 3 years apart. There was DNA evidence in Nanette's case too, but in 1986, the testing didn't exist to use it. By the time testing existed, the case had already gone cold, and the evidence was sitting in storage, with no obvious path forward. It might have stayed there forever. Instead, the science that cracked Stephanie's case also, quietly and without fanfare, named Nanette Vanderburg's killer 35 years later. 2 women, 2 families. One man who killed, walked free, killed again, and then died. Never arrested for either murder, never tried, never sentenced for what he had done. The science arrived too late to imprison him, but it did not arrive too late to name him. And for 2 families who had lived for decades not knowing, having the name was something. It wasn't justice, but it was the truth. And the truth, after 32 years, was the only thing left to give them. There is a specific kind of grief that belongs to families of cold case victims, different from the grief of families whose cases are solved quickly, different even from the grief of families whose cases are never solved. It is the grief of the in-between, of knowing the crime happened, having the evidence, and still not having the answer, of watching technology advance and each time hoping and each time coming up short, of a father calling the lab every few months for 32 years just to hear there was still nothing new. Detective Terry Miller spent 3 years, calling John Isaacson and Sharon Gares every 6 months. Not because there was news, because she thought they deserved to hear a human voice from the department that was supposed to be working on their daughter's case. That call, made twice a year with nothing new to report, is what a cold case looks like from the inside. It is not dramatic. It is someone picking up a phone and saying, "We haven't forgotten her." When the case finally broke, it broke in a way that gave the Isaacson family an answer, but not justice. Marchand was dead. There was no arrest to watch, no trial to attend, no moment of public accountability. Just a name, announced at a press conference, belonging to a man who had been gone since 1995. The case was solved in the most technical sense of the word, and completely unsatisfying in every human sense. John Isaacson's quote said it all. He had wanted to look the man in the eye. He never would. The science that identified the killer had come in time to give him a name, but not in time to give him the confrontation, the trial, the verdict, the sentence that the father of a murdered child has every right to want. The case was solved, and also, in the deepest sense, unresolved. Both things are true, and they don't cancel each other out. If there's a lesson in Stephanie Isaacson's case, it's about the difference between giving up and waiting. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department never gave up on this case. They kept the evidence. They tested it. Every time the technology gave them a reason to try, they assigned a detective to maintain a human relationship with a grieving father for 3 years, even when she had nothing new to tell him. And when a private citizen wrote a $5,000 check and a Texas lab said they could try, they said yes. None of that is dramatic. None of it made headlines until the press conference in July of 2021, but all of it was necessary. If any one link in that chain had broken, if someone had thrown away the shirt, if no one had called Justin Wu, if Kim Murga hadn't selected Stephanie's case, if Othram hadn't taken on a sample that small, Darren Marchand's name never comes out. He remains unknown, and Stephanie Isaacson's father lives the rest of his life without even a name. He got the name, not the trial, not the sentence, just the name. But the name was real, and verified, and permanent. No one can take it back. Whatever Darren Marchand thought he had gotten away with, he did not get away with it. He died thinking he had. He was wrong. 15 cells, 32 years, $5,000. Stephanie Isaacson was 14 years old. She rode motorcycles with her father and went scuba diving at Lake Mead, and she was walking to school on a June morning in 1989, and she deserved to make it there. It took 32 years to say her killer's name out loud, but her city didn't stop saying hers. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you believe these cases deserve to be told, subscribe. The next one is coming.